In its second year of production, the redesigned Ram pickup continues to take the truck world by storm. To build on that success, for 1995, Chrysler is introducing a club cab version of the Ram pickup. Welcome to MasterTech. In this program, we're going to briefly cover the newest addition to the Dodge truck lineup, the Ram Club Cab. The second part of this program looks at servicing a manual transmission that was coupled to the Cummins diesel from 1989 until 1993 to provide a winning combination. We're talking about the Getrag G360. To satisfy truck buyer requirements, the Ram Club Cab is available with a variety of payloads, wheelbases, and trim levels in both two-wheel and four-wheel drive. A chart in this month's reference book summarizes model availability. Note that the short wheelbase 2500 will not be available until early 1995. Standard and optional engine and transmission combinations for 4x2 and 4x4 models are also summarized in this month's reference book. Engines range from the 5.2-liter Magnum V8, standard on the 1500 series, up to the 8-liter V10 and Cummins diesel, optional on 2500 HD and 3500 models. Of course, the big change in Ram Club Cab is in its interior. 20 inches have been added to the Ram pickup interior for a rear bench seat that can accommodate up to 3 passengers. 3-point unibelt seat belts are provided for outboard passengers, while a lap belt is provided for center passengers. The wide door opening provides easy access to the rear seat, and on SLT models, 40-20-40 front seats have a tip and slide feature. Lifting the latch on the back of outboard seats causes the seat back to fold forward and the seat track to slide forward at the same time. Lifting the seat track lever allows the seat to return to its original position. SLT models also featured 2 rear cup holders molded into the rear trim panels. To provide rear passengers with additional ventilation, all Ram Club cabs have rear quarter windows with a flip-open design. The rear quarter window closes against a rubber seal, and the backlight glass uses a rubber seal. The Club Cab should help to make the redesigned Ram pickup even more successful than it already is. Now let's turn our attention to a past success, the transmission that was designed to handle the torque from the Cummins diesel, the Getrag G360. The G360 5-speed manual transmission was built exclusively for Chrysler by Getrag Gears of North America. It was used behind the Cummins diesel from 1989 through 1993, when it was replaced by the NV 4500 HD. From 1989 until 1992, the transmission was serviced as an assembly. In 1993, due to the overwhelming number of trucks sold with Getrag transmissions, that policy was changed and overhaul was permitted. The overhaul procedure for the Getrag is detailed in the 1993 rear-wheel drive truck manual. At the time the procedure was written, the gear case, rear retainer, counter gear, and counter shaft were not serviceable. However, that has since changed, and you can now order these parts separately. The 1990 to 1993 light-duty truck parts catalog contains the parts listings for the Getrag, including an overhaul kit, which contains all of the replacements for non-reusable parts, as well as other parts that are ordinarily replaced during overhaul. Many of the parts in the overhaul kit, such as bearings, blocker rings, and spacers, are not available separately. Transmission overhaul is a big job, and not one you want to do unnecessarily, so make sure the transmission is at fault before disassembling it. Some noise complaints associated with the transmission may have other causes. Technical Service Bulletin 6194 contains a procedure for diagnosing a cyclic groaning or harsh noise below 1400 RPM. Note that in some cases the noise may be driver-related, the result of selecting a gear that is too high for the speed the truck is traveling. The noise may also be due to clutch spring dampening characteristics, and the TSB contains a repair procedure if this is the case. If the transmission has been worked on recently, you may want to first check the output shaft and counter shaft assembly preload, as described later in this program. A technician used to setting end play may have set the preload improperly. In the next section, we're going to begin our look at transmission overhaul. But first, try answering this review question on transmission replacement. Technician A says that if the counter shaft is damaged, the Getrag transmission must be replaced. Technician B says the same holds true for the rear retainer. Who's right? A only, B only, both A and B, or neither A nor B? The answer is neither A nor B. These parts are now available separately. Before we get into transmission disassembly, let's talk about some of the tools you'll need to do the job. You don't need any special tools to overhaul the Getrag G360. However, you will need a large capacity impact wrench to remove yoke nuts on two-wheel drive transmissions, a depth gauge for measuring preload, brass punches, a bearing splitter, and pieces of pipe to be used with a large capacity shop press capable of exerting at least 20 tons of force. The press needs to have an adjustable bed plate and movable press plates. The press requirement may seem high, but some components are a tight fit, and a smaller press simply will not do the job. As mentioned earlier, the procedures for Getrag overhaul are detailed in the 1993 Rear-Wheel Drive Truck Service Manual. Removing assemblies from the Getrag gear case is pretty straightforward. Start by removing the shift cover. Be sure to pry evenly on two sides of the shift cover assembly when removing it. Prying on one side at a time can damage the assembly. Then remove the front and rear bearing retainers. On two-wheel drive models, you must remove the yoke before removing the rear retainer. The yoke nut has considerable torque on it, and you'll need to use a high-capacity impact wrench to remove it. To remove the input shaft bearing race from the front of the case, or the output shaft and counter shaft races from the rear, use a mallet to tap the case and loosen the races. Take care not to hit the races themselves. To remove the output shaft assembly, you must first move the input shaft forward in the case. To do this, you need to position the flats on the input shaft gear clutch teeth downward to clear the output shaft. Then you can remove the output shaft assembly and the input shaft assembly. The steps for countershaft gear removal vary according to whether the Getrag has an early or later style case. You can tell which case you're working on by the radius in the reverse idler area. Later cases have a full radius as shown here. In either case, you'll need to first remove the countershaft bearing cap, large snap ring and bearing race, and the small rear bearing snap ring. Then you can remove the countershaft. Hit the cap with a punch to loosen it, but take care not to put a hole in the cap when doing so. You could damage the bearing. Also, take care when tapping the countershaft out of the case. Use a brass punch to avoid damaging the shaft. On early style cases, you'll need to remove the reverse idler gear before removing the counter gear. On later style cases, such as the one we're working on, simply rotate the counter gear past the reverse idler gear. Case design also affects reverse idler gear removal. On the later style case, use a pin punch to remove the idler shaft pins. These pins are not reusable. Then remove the reverse idler bolt from the side of the case. This is a unique bolt, so take care not to mix it with other fasteners. Next, remove the reverse idler shaft. Either hold the gear assembly or use a short piece of pipe to keep the reverse gear components from dropping into the case. The procedure for removing the reverse idler gear assembly on early style cases is slightly different.
So be sure to use the service manual as a guide. And as we said earlier, you need to remove the reverse idler gear before removing the counter gear on these cases. Output shaft disassembly is also straightforward. However, there are a few items to keep in mind during the procedure. First, do not disassemble the 3rd, 4th, 1st, 2nd, or 5th reverse synchros. They are serviced as assemblies. Second, when pressing onto the bearings and gears, have a helper support the output shaft assembly. It is heavy, and if it falls, the assembly could be damaged. To begin the output shaft disassembly, press the rear bearing and 5th gear off the output shaft by positioning a bearing splitter under 5th gear. After removing the 5th gear bearing halves, remove the snap ring and blocker ring. Next, use flat blade screwdrivers to pry off reverse gear and the 5th reverse synchro. You may need to use the bearing splitter and press if these components are difficult to remove. Remove the reverse gear bearing from the gear or the shaft. Then remove the thrust washer snap ring. Next, position 1st gear on the press plates and press the gear and the thrust washer off the shaft. Remove the 1st gear bearing from the gear or shaft. Then mark the 1st, 2nd synchro assembly so it can be positioned with the same side facing up during installation. The pilot bearing, 3rd, 4th synchro, and 3rd gear are removed as a unit. To remove these, position the bearing splitter under 3rd gear and press the components off the shaft. Remove the 3rd gear bearing from the gear or shaft. Then remove the thrust washer snap ring. Next, position 2nd gear on the press plates and press it and the thrust washer off the shaft. The 2nd gear bearing can then be removed from the gear or the shaft. At this point, you can further disassemble the 1st and 2nd gear assemblies by removing their blocker rings. The blocker rings are secured with roll pins. To remove the 1st gear blocker ring, simply tap the roll pins out and remove the ring. For 2nd gear ring removal, first tap each roll pin about 3/4 of the way through the ring. Then pry off the blocker ring. You'll need to replace the blocker ring if you use a lot of force to remove it. You can remove the pins from the gear with locking pliers, but they are not reusable. Once the transmission is disassembled, you need to clean and inspect components carefully for damage or wear. Inspect the shafts and gears for wear or damage. If gear teeth are broken or chipped, they'll have to be replaced. However, keep in mind that discoloration or shiny spots on gear teeth are a normal condition and do not necessarily call for replacement. Some transmission parts are not reusable and must be replaced during overhaul. These include blocker ring pins, reverse idler shaft pins, the front countershaft bearing cap, and snap rings. You also need to replace the front retainer seal and the output shaft seal in the rear retainer. The springs on these seals must face toward the inside of the case. As mentioned earlier, these non-reusable parts are only available as part of an overhaul kit. Replacement parts such as bearings, races, blocker rings, and spacers are also only available as part of this kit. Some components are serviced as assemblies. These include the 3rd, 4th, 1st, 2nd, and 5th reverse synchros. On the shift cover, the boot and its clamp, the shift lever seat and its snap ring, and the backup lamp switch are serviceable separately. If the cover, shift rails, shift forks, or detent components are damaged or worn, you must replace the shift cover assembly. If the counter shaft or counter gear is damaged or worn, you'll need to replace them. However, You can smooth over minor nicks or scratches with a number 240 to 400 emery cloth. Before we move on to transmission assembly, let's check your knowledge of Getrag Disassembly. The counter gear can be removed before the reverse idler gear on A, early style cases, B, later style cases, or C, all cases. The answer is B, later style cases. On earlier cases, the reverse idler gear must be removed first. Once you've obtained replacements for non-reusable parts and for parts which are damaged or worn, you can begin transmission assembly. There are a few items you'll need to have on hand when putting the transmission back together. Use Mopar 5W30 engine oil to lubricate parts. This is also the lubricant the transmission uses. Use petroleum jelly to keep parts, such as bearing halves, in place. Do not use grease. You'll need to use Mopar adhesive sealant on the counter shaft front bearing cap. Mopar gasket maker for other sealing surfaces without a gasket. And Mopar Perfect Seal for the shift cover gasket. You'll also need Mopar Lock and Seal for the Getrag's bolts and for the yoke nut on two-wheel drive transmissions. Transmission assembly begins with first and second gear blocker ring installation. Make sure the pins are seated flush with the surface of the blocker rings, but take care not to drive the pins below the surface. Once the pins are in place, install second gear with its bearing in the forward end of the output shaft. The second gear thrust washer installed next is a tight fit, so heat the washer to no more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit to expand it. You can also seat the washer with a piece of pipe. The thrust washer snap ring is a select fit. Use the thickest snap ring that will fit in the groove. Next, install third gear with its bearing on the shaft, followed by the third gear blocker ring. There are a couple of things to keep in mind when installing the next component, the third-fourth Synchro assembly. First, the long shoulder of the Synchro assembly fits inside third gear. Second, make sure the blocker ring aligns with the Synchro assembly before tapping or pressing the assembly into place. The pilot bearing is a tight fit, so expand it with heat or press it into place with a suitable tool. At this point, you'll need to turn the output shaft over so the rear of the shaft is facing up. The first part installed on this end is the first-second Synchro assembly. New first-second Synchros can be installed either way up on the shaft. However, if you reuse the original first-second Synchro, position it the same way it came off the shaft. Next, install the first gear bearing on the shaft, followed by first gear with its blocker ring. Work first gear back and forth until the first gear blocker ring seats into the Synchro assembly. The first gear thrust washer is another tight fit on the shaft, so either heat it or use a piece of pipe or brass punch to position it against first gear. The thrust washer snap ring is next. It's also a select fit. Take care not to overspread it. And make sure the snap ring seats in its groove. You may need to tap it with a punch. Next, install reverse gear with its bearing on the output shaft. Then install the blocker ring in the reverse gear. The fifth reverse Synchro is next. As with the other Synchro installation, align the blocker ring with the Synchro. Then press the Synchro into place. Install the fifth reverse snap ring next. Like the thrust washer snap rings, this is a select fit part. Install the thickest snap ring which will fit in the groove. You may need to move the Synchro into the reverse position to select and install the snap ring. The fifth gear bearing halves are next. You can hold them in place with petroleum jelly. After positioning the blocker ring in the fifth reverse Synchro sleeve, install fifth gear on the shaft. you can complete output shaft assembly by pressing the rear bearing on the output shaft. At this point, it's a good idea to verify the order of components on the output shaft. Use the 1993 service manual or this month's reference book as a guide. The next step in transmission assembly depends on whether the gear case is an early or later design. On later style gear cases, such as the one shown here, you can install the reverse idler assembly before installing the counter gear. On early style cases, the counter gear must be installed first. To install the reverse idler assembly in a new style case, first install the bearings and spacer in the reverse idler gear. The spacer must be positioned between the bearings. Place a thrust washer on each end of the assembly. The slots on the thrust washers must face outward so that pins can be inserted in the idler shaft. Then, with the idler assembly positioned in the case, push the idler shaft into the case. While pushing the shaft in, position its holes so that new pins can be inserted. Next, after applying Mopar lock and seal to the idler shaft bolt, install the bolt and tighten it to 40 foot-pounds. At this point, insert the pins. Check washer side clearance by inserting a feeler gauge between the idler gear and the thrust washer. Clearance should be between 2 and 10/1000ths of an inch. The procedure for installing the idler shaft assembly in early style cases is slightly different. Be sure to see the procedure in the 1993 service manual if you're working on a transmission with this type of case. On later style cases, such as the one we're working with, you can now install the counter gear and counter shaft. To do this, you first need to position the gear case with its front face up. Next, rotate the counter gear past the reverse idler gear and into position in the case. If the counter shaft bearing was damaged, you'll need to press a new one on the shaft and install the snap ring at this time. Then install the counter shaft and front bearing into the case and through the counter gear. Seat the front bearing in the case and install the front bearing race. And the snap ring for the race. The front bearing cap needs to be sealed to the case. To do this, coat the outer edge of the bearing cap with Mopar adhesive sealant before installing it in the gear case. To complete the counter shaft installation, install the rear bearing and its snap ring on the rear of the counter shaft. At this point, if you haven't already done so, install a new seal in the front bearing retainer. Tap the seal into place with a pipe. And as mentioned earlier, make sure the spring is facing toward the inside of the case. To install the input shaft, position it so that the flats on the clutch gear teeth face downward as you slide it into the case. Then install the output shaft in the gear case. Next, install the front bearing race in the input shaft bearing bore. At this point, you're ready to install the front bearing retainer. Apply Mopar gasket maker to the retainer flange surface and oil the lip of the retainer seal. The retainer is symmetrical and can be installed in any of the 4 positions the bolt holes line up. Be sure to apply Mopar lock and seal to the retainer bolts. Bolts in the Overhaul kit have thread locker already applied. Tighten them to 16 to 22 foot-pounds of torque. Next, install the output shaft rear bearing race with a plastic mallet. Install the counter shaft bearing race in the same way. Before installing the rear retainer, you have to determine the shim thickness needed to place a preload on the output shaft and counter shaft bearings. Without this preload, you'll end up with loose bearings and a noisy transmission. To determine shim thickness, support the front end of the transmission on wood blocks so the rear surface is facing up. Then make sure the rear bearing races are fully seated against their bearings. Next, measure the distance from the top of the counter shaft and the output shaft rear bearing race to the gear case. Record the measurements, since they will be used in your calculations. Next, move to the rear retainer and measure and record the depth of the bearing bores for the output shaft and the counter shaft. At this point, you're ready to calculate the shim thickness needed to place a 6 thousandths to 8 thousandths of an inch preload on the bearings. First, for each bearing, subtract the bearing race height measurement from the retainer bore depth. Then add the preload. So if the output shaft race measurement is 245 thousandths, and the retainer bore that fits over the output shaft is 257 thousandths deep, the result is 12 thousandths. Then add the 6 to 8 thousandths of an inch of preload. The result is a shim thickness of 20 thousandths to be placed in the rear retainer bore that corresponds to the output shaft. Before placing the shims in the retainer, if you haven't already done so, install a new output shaft seal in the retainer. On two-wheel drive models, place the speedometer gear and spacers on the output shaft. On both two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive transmissions, place the correct shim thickness in each bearing bore. Place the thinnest shims at the rear of the pack. You can hold them in place with petroleum jelly. As with the front retainer, use Mopar gasket maker on the retainer sealing surface. Take care not to disturb the shims when installing the rear retainer. Use the bolts with pre-applied thread locker, or apply Mopar lock and seal to the bolts. Install the bolts and tighten them to 16 to 22 foot-pounds of torque. At this point, on two-wheel drive transmissions, you'll need to lube the yoke seal with engine oil and install the yoke and yoke nut. Tighten the yoke nut to 280 foot-pounds of torque. The shift cover is next. Even though some early transmissions were not built with a shift cover gasket, you'll need to use a gasket on these as well. Use Mopar Perfect Seal on the gasket and make sure the synchronizer sleeves are in the neutral position. Install the cover so that the shift forks align with the Synchro sleeves, and the cover aligns with the bolt holes and dowels. Unless thread locker is pre-applied, the shift cover bolts also require Mopar lock and seal. Tighten the bolts to 16 to 22 foot-pounds. All that's left to do is to fill the transmission to the bottom of the fill plug hole with Mopar 5W30 engine oil. And all that's left for you to answer is our final review question. The output shaft rear bearing race is 20 thousandths of an inch above the gear case, and output bearing bore in the rear retainer is 40 thousandths of an inch deep. With a preload of 7 thousandths of an inch, what is the correct shim thickness? A, 67 thousandths, B, 53 thousandths, or C, 27 thousandths? The answer is C, 27 thousandths of an inch. To find the shim thickness, subtract the race height from the bore depth and add the preload. That brings us to the end of another MasterTech bonus program. A brief look at the Ram Club cab and overhauling the Getrag transmission. The Getrag is a lot of transmission, but with the information in this program and in the 1993 service manual, you'll be able to get the G360 back on the road. We'll see you next month on MasterTech.